I created this short video to talk about the final project for our course and how to get started with your dataset. First off, just talking about the requirements for the final project. This final project will be 15% of your overall grade, and I would like to see that you have typed as much of the project as possible, of course using complete sentences, and then using tables, charts, and graphs and calculations when necessary. I would like you to upload this as a PDF, just as you've been doing with the handwritten homework, and this needs to be submitted in Canvas by 11:59 p.m. on Wednesday, December 9th, so the week of final exams. As stated on this page, it says the goal of this project is for each student to apply what you have learned about analysis and interpretation of statistics this quarter. And I want you to do this using a topic that interests you. I really hope for this project to be something that you find meaningful and to show that you're connecting the ideas and concepts that you've learned in statistics to something that you are interested in your everyday life. So here are the steps that you will take to complete your project. First off, this is the biggest challenge in my opinion, and that is to decide on a topic. There are an unlimited number of topics that you may choose from, and those are anything from baseball, weather, the stock market, elections, healthcare, hunting, cars, video games. There are an endless number of things that you could use, and this data set could be anything from something that you have found on the internet to a data set that you have created yourself. And I'll talk about that more here in just a minute. Once you find your data set, then you are ready to start working on the different pieces of the project related to each chapter that we have covered or that we will cover. In chapter 1, you're going to talk about things like the population of interest for your data set, where your data came from, the type of sampling methods that might have occurred, and some of these things you may not actually know because the data was collected by somebody else. So go through and address each of these topics for chapter 1. In chapter 2, you will construct a frequency table for categorical data and also a bar chart. And then for quantitative data, you'll construct a frequency table and a histogram to go with that. And I'll show some examples of these in a minute, but of course you're always welcome to ask questions as well. So if you get stuck along the way, please reach out to me. For chapter 3, you will state the mean and standard deviation for your data set and use your histogram from chapter 2 to analyze the distribution of the data. So talking about if your data is left skewed, right skewed, symmetric, etc. Chapter 4, you'll look at some probabilities. Chapter 6, you'll look at the normal distribution and z-scores and probabilities, the central limit theorem, etc. So let's talk about how to come up with a data set. Again, I think this is the most challenging part of getting started with the project, is just thinking about what you want to research and how you can really apply the different pieces of the project to that data set. So a couple different things that you can do. One is you can just go to Google and start trying to find data sets using Google, and they're definitely out there. You might have something specific in mind. But I think this is going to be a little bit more straightforward. One option is that you can go into MyMathLab and click on the StatCrunch button, and then click on the button that says data sets from your textbook. So these are data sets that are actually inside of the textbook if you actually had the hard copy of the textbook. But many of the problems that you see in the homework actually refer to some of these different data sets. So you can click on any of these data sets and find, for example, I just clicked on the one that said tornadoes, and you see a list of different tornadoes, the year that they happened, the month, fatalities, etc. So that's one way that you could come up with a data set, is by just loading a data set from the textbook itself. Another thing that you can do is you can go into StatCrunch, and you can actually just access this by going to statcrunch.com and signing in with your MyLab account. And you can click on data sets. And then we have just all kinds of different data sets available to us that other people have loaded. Again, these are data sets that people have uploaded, so these may not give accurate data. We don't really know. For example, this one that says average wedding costs, if you decided to use that, see what that looks like. This data set doesn't look like it would be a great data set to use, because all we are seeing here is that we have the years 2018, 2017, and 2016, but then we do not have any labels on the rows, so I really don't know what these numbers are referring to. These could be dollars per person that attended the wedding, or maybe they're supposed to be thousands of dollars. We just really don't know. So I would not recommend using a data set that isn't clearly labeled. And some of these may turn out to be that way. Major League Baseball team data set here. And this one does give quite a few different variables to work with. So that one looks like something that you could probably do something with. I decided to type in a couple of different things into the search here. So you, for example, you could type in, let's type in the word pets. When I type in the word pets, I come up with several different data sets here, and you could search through some of these and see if any of them look like something that maybe you could use for your data set if you like. You can type in whatever word you'd like here to see if there are any data sets that match that. I typed in the word Facebook and came up with several different options. I chose this one that says responses to social media survey. And this one looks like a pretty good data set to work with. I have the first one here just says response ID. This is going to be a column that I don't really need to work with because this number is not going to be important to me. Think of it like a student ID number. This variable right here really isn't going to matter for my project. The variables that I can see here, age, gender, media app. This one says media app other, time spent, times per day, and posts. So I can clearly see here what the different variables are meant to mean. It also said back here, respondents provided their most used social media application, how many minutes they spent on their social media per day, the number of times they visited social media per day, the number of posts they made per week, their gender, and their age. This does say that respondents provided the data, so that does look like it was self-reported, something that we could talk about in the Chapter 1 material. And this clearly gives me some more information about some of these different variables. For example, this one just says time spent, but this was really time spent per day. So I could go ahead and add that in there to help remind myself. And this one was actually posts per week. So once you have your data set ready, and this one again is a good one because all of the variables are labeled, and I also have some categorical variables as well as some quantitative variables. So that will be helpful when I'm trying to look at bar charts versus histograms, for example. So just to provide an example here of something that you'll do as you're looking through the chapter contents of what is required for the project. You're going to be using things in StatCrunch such as the summary stats are going to be helpful in coming up with means and standard deviations, and hopefully you've already done that in the course for the homework and quizzes and exams. You can also use StatCrunch to help you with the charting, and then you can take screenshots of those charts and put those into your project. So I would expect that you're going to type this into Microsoft Word or some other word processor, and then you can just attach the pictures right into that. This doesn't ever have to be printed out because you are just going to upload as a PDF for me. For example, let's say that we want to see the differences in males and females as far as the media app that they prefer to use. So I could choose to make a bar chart, or they say bar plot, and I'm going to use my data to do that. So I would like to look at the media app, and I'm going to group that by the gender. So I'm trying to look at the different media apps, and I want to know how the media apps are distributed by gender. I can also choose to label my horizontal and vertical axes and create a title for my chart. So you can experiment with these different things here. It actually did a good job of labeling for me. On the horizontal axis, it says media apps. So we have all of the different media apps here. And you can see, for example, that for Facebook, there are a large number of females compared to the males that prefer Facebook. Although it does look like the same is true with Instagram, Snapchat, but then Twitter is actually pretty even for males and females, and other apps, it appears that males have the lead in that one. So that's just an example of a bar chart that you could create, just one of the many options that I would have as far as a bar chart with categorical data for this particular data set. You can see from the frequencies over here that this data set is quite large. So we've got frequencies in the thousands. If you wanted to work with a smaller data set, you could go through and take out every 10th person, for example, and then use that data as your own kind of subset of this data set, if you like, just to make things a little bit easier as far as the sample size. Another thing that you'll need to do is to come up with a mean and a standard deviation. And again, that can only be for quantitative data. So you could find the mean and standard deviation for the ages. I think for me, I would be less interested in the mean and standard deviation of the age column and more interested in the mean and standard deviation of the things like time spent per day or posts per week. So for example, if we go to summary stats and we look at summary stats for columns, we can actually go ahead and come up with the summary stats for all of these. If we just select all 4 of those. And we see that there are, we have sample size here. So there's actually 5,206 people who participated in this survey. And the mean for those survey respondents was 25.36 years with a standard deviation of about 11.3 years. And then we can see the median and the range. So we have a very large range here for the age. I don't know, let's see. The min value was 4 years old and the maximum value was 98 years old. I'm not sure if there's actually a 4-year-old who completed this survey, so that makes me wonder about possibly an outlier, and that's something else that you'll want to talk about in the project if you notice that there are outliers. For the time spent per day, not everybody answered that question because we see a smaller sample size here, but the mean number of minutes spent per day on social media was 110.3 approximately, with a standard deviation of 158. And we see the median of 60, 1,000 was the range. So somebody actually reported spending 1,000 minutes per day on social media. And again, that could be considered an outlier potentially, depending on if that's really far from what some of the other values look like. But that would be 16 hours. It's actually closer to 17 hours that somebody is spending on social media per day. So that seems like it would be maybe somebody just didn't care to really answer the question truthfully, and so they just entered in whatever number came to mind. We can see that the values for the quartiles down here are much smaller. So the 1,000 does seem pretty outrageous. The times that people checked their social media per day. So the mean number of checks on social media or logins to their social media per day, 22. That seems pretty high. And then we have, again, a range of 200. So that's pretty high. The number of posts per week. So about 7.5 posts per week with a standard deviation of 23. So, and then again, the range was 200 here. So there's actually somebody who reported that they post 200 times per week on their social media, which is, seems like that would be quite a bit. That might be, again, an outlier. So this is something, again, that you could just kind of take a screenshot of this and post that in your project so that you can see all of the summary statistics for the quantitative variables that you have. You can also use StatCrunch to create a histogram. So let's say that we wanted to create a histogram of the ages of people reporting on this survey. And sometimes you have to experiment a little bit with these to see what kind of gives you a good idea of what your distribution is going to look like. So I'm just going to select the age data set, and then we'll kind of go from there and see if we need to tweak anything. This actually looks pretty good. It looks like we do have a very small number of respondents that are under age 20 or so. And then we have a large number of respondents that are right around 20 years old. So this would be a right skewed distribution, and that's something else that we could talk about in our project, is just to report that the age seems to be distributed in a right skewed direction, where we have a lot of people in the lower range between 20 and 30 approximately, and then not as many out from there. In chapter 4, I'd like you to create a contingency table so that you can come up with some probabilities from that contingency table. And to do that, you go to Stat, and then to Tables, and then to Contingency with Data. So that just means that you're going to use the data set to do that. You can then select a row. So maybe I want to compare genders with media apps. Again, we kind of looked at that before in a bar chart. And then I'll compute. So I now have a contingency table that shows, for example, there were 1,061 female Facebook users, 687 female Instagram users, and then we only have, let's say, 487 Snapchat users that are male. We have a total of 5,223 respondents. So you can use that contingency table to come up with some probabilities. When you get to chapter 7, you'll be talking about confidence intervals. And StatCrunch can create confidence intervals for you, but I would actually like to see your calculations. So you could come up with a confidence interval. For example, we could use this data set to come up with a confidence interval for the mean time spent per day by all social media users. And we would do that by finding the mean and standard deviation for the time spent per day. And we actually already did that when we came up with our summary statistics. And then we would plug those into the formulas for chapter 7 to come up with our confidence interval. So for that kind of thing, I would like to see your handwritten work. And you could always just take a little snapshot of your handwritten work with your phone and then upload that into the Word documents that you create for your project. Now, I'm not sure how exciting this data set really is to people. I think it's interesting to see how much time people spend on social media, or maybe which types of social media are used more frequently or by which genders, but it's not something that is going to be really meaningful to me and my life. I would really encourage you to try to find something, try to either find a data set that is going to be something that you really are excited to work with, or another option would be to actually create your own data. And I don't mean to just make up numbers, but this is something that I don't have access to the numbers, but I would love to be able to do something like this if I, for example, worked at a coffee shop. So what I did here is I went into StatCrunch. So if you just go to statcrunch.com, and then go to Open StatCrunch, it's just going to load in a completely empty table for you to start filling in with data values. And so you might, for example, decide that you would really like to see if there is a difference in the amount of tips that you earn at the coffee shop that you work at on maybe different days of the week, or maybe by different colors of cars that come through the drive-through, or maybe if it's before or afternoon. Does that matter? Does it matter how much the person spent on how much they're going to end up tipping you? So this would require that you do a little bit more work as far as the collecting of the data, but honestly, it might actually be less work as far as going out and trying to find a data set that you really want to work with. That can be kind of tedious in itself because a lot of data sets aren't really what you're hoping for when you open them up. They're not labeled well, and so sometimes it's nice to be able to come up with your own data. And I think it's much more meaningful that way as well. So if I were, again, working at a coffee shop and I could come up with these different variables, and there may even be some other variables that you can think of that would be great to add in here that would be sort of interesting to think about. So what you would do then as you are collecting your data, you're probably not going to have StatCrunch up when you are collecting your data. So you could just write this on a piece of paper, but you would just go through and you'd say, okay, on Monday, there was a blue car that came through and they came in before noon. Their purchase total was $4.81 and they gave me a 19-cent tip, let's say that they just rounded it up. So that would be just one line of data. And I have some quantitative variables in here and some categorical. And then once I've completed this, like maybe I come up with 30 data values or 30 different people that came in. And I then have 5 different pieces of information about each one of those transactions. We can start looking at things like the relationship between the color of the car and the tip amount, or did they come in before or afternoon and the tip amount, just things like that that we could see if there's really a noticeable difference. So I think using a data set like this that you've actually come up with yourself would be a lot more meaningful, a lot more insightful. I know that this would require potentially a little bit more time to do and is a little bit more creative. So it's just something that you have to think about. But I think that the just coming up with a data set or finding the data set really is going to be the hardest part. And then completing each part of the project itself will be a little bit easier. But I do expect to have some questions as you're working through these different parts of the project. So please reach out if you have questions. I'm sure if you have questions, other people do as well. Hopefully we will have some really great projects to look at the end of the quarter.